plan policy or a specific plan policy, any new ordinance that affects the area in question gets routed through the MAC for their input before it goes to our policy-making, decision-making bodies, such as the Planning Commission and then ultimately the Board of Supervisors. After the MAC has made a recommendation for approval, it goes to a higher body, as I mentioned. The recommendation likely stays the same, as I also mentioned as well. Usually there's about a 30-day delay or sort of waiting period between the MAC hearing and the subsequent hearing that just allows staff to be able to recreate a new staff report and calendar. It also has to be legally noticed as well before it goes on to the next hearing body. The next hearing body is generally very similar to the MAC, the process. The applicant presents the project. The board has opportunity to ask questions of the applicant. The public hearing is opened and folks get to provide comment on the project. The public hearing is closed, deliberation ensues, and then a decision is made. That's generally the format for both the BZA and the Planning Commission. As I mentioned, the Planning Director, the Board of Zoning Adjustments, and the Planning Commission are generally in sync with the MAC. If any decision is appealed, generally it will end up at the full Board of Supervisors. They are the sort of last stop in this process. Any appeal from the BZA or Planning Commission goes to the full board for a decision. The Board of Supervisors, they hold what we call a de novo hearing, which means that all the information is heard anew, fresh, and so they look at it with a sort of clean slate or a fresh perspective, and then they also render a decision. The process is sort of repeated in terms of the public hearing process. The decisions of the Board of Supervisors are final, unless you want to take legal action against the county and challenge a decision. They usually are the last stop, although we have, it's not unusual for a decision to be challenged by an agreed party, and I can give you a couple examples of that if you want as well. And so on this last slide, it just kind of sum up, just kind of shows you the role of the MAC and sort of who they're advisory to. The planning director, the site development review is sort of our, I won't say the easiest permit to get, but it's sort of the one that has the less findings, a little less sort of analysis that needs to happen. The BZA, they see conditional use permits and variances. I put code enforcement here and just highlighted because that is actually something that does not go to the MAC. The code enforcement, for example, if you have a neighbor and they have an abandoned vehicle where their weeds are too high or a bunch of junk in the front yard and you call code enforcement, there's a process for abatement and where it includes a site visit, inspection. You kind of get a warning letter. If you don't do anything, then we set you for a hearing, and that hearing goes straight to the BZA. It doesn't go to the MAC, and the BZA is the board that sort of deals with all the abatement, the timing of abatement, how that will look, and they can actually levy fines and fees as well. So that's the only thing that really doesn't go to the MAC. Planning Commission, their jurisdiction includes major subdivisions, general plan policy, specific plan policy, and that will go to the MAC as well before coming to them. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the last step is the Board of Supervisors for any appeals and any other major policy decisions like changes to the general plan and specific plan adoption as well. So I think that covers it for me. I know there may be questions. Are we going to have some time at the end, or do you want me to take questions now or at the end? Okay. Well, thank you very much, and be happy to take questions later. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name's Heather. Can you hear me? Is this mic on? How about now? All right. Good to see you, everyone. My name's Heather Littlejohn. I'm a deputy county counsel in the office of the county counsel. I work with a community development agency, including Albert Lopez, planning director, on various land use issues. And I'm here to talk to you today about the local government structure that you do have today, and potentially what some options would be that are a little bit different than what you have today, or significantly different than what you have today, just as structures that are available. So I want to start with just an overview of the topics I'm going to cover today. So I'm going to talk about incorporation, and that is essentially the transition from an unincorporated area to an actual incorporated city. That's sort of one of the options going forward. But the other two that you have currently are the Board of Zoning Adjustments and the Municipal Advisory Council, which Albert just described in our current process. And while there are some community service districts in Alameda County, Castro Valley is not currently one, and that's something you might want to consider, as well as a planning commission dedicated to the area of Castro Valley. So those are the 5 topics I'm going to cover, starting with incorporation. And as you all probably are very aware, because Castro Valley is an unincorporated area, all of the functions relative to health and safety, general welfare, the overall general police functions of a municipal environment are performed by the county. If Castro Valley or any unincorporated area were to incorporate, all of those powers would then go to the city that is formed. So that includes the right to contract, the right to own and sell property, the right and responsibility to sue and be sued. All of those general corporate powers as a subdivision of the state would flow to that city. And all of the police powers, so the general health and safety and welfare regulations and oversight would be conducted by that city as opposed to by the county government. There is some overlap between county governance and city governance, even in the incorporated areas we have today. So for example, restaurant inspections are conducted by the County Department of Environmental Health. So most of the public health and safety functions are done by the municipal entity, but there is some county governance depending on the subject matter. The process to incorporate as a city is pretty long and detailed. It's overseen by the Local Area Formation Commission, or LAFCO. Every county has a LAFCO. Alameda County LAFCO has specific procedures that it's adopted to implement state law, but generally how a city incorporates is governed by a very long and detailed specific state law called the Cortese-Knox-Hertzberg Act. I'm going to distill it into one slide for you, so you don't have to read the whole thing today. But essentially, there's a process of applying, having that application reviewed, submission to the voters, and a final decision by LAFCO on the application to incorporate. The initiation of the application can either be done by the county, that would be by the Board of Supervisors deciding to submit it to LAFCO, or there could be a petition by the potential voters in the area. So that if we were talking about incorporating Castro Valley, that would look like at least 25% of the voters in the Castro Valley area petitioning for incorporation. The other option is for 25% of the landowners having at least 25% of the value of the land in the area petitioning. So it's either the number of people or the number of voters or the number of or the percentage of the landowners. So either way, the application has to be initiated. There have to be at least 500 registered voters in the area, so Castro Valley would certainly meet that requirement. The application is pretty detailed. It's got to incorporate, and I use the term feasibility study, but it's not necessarily that formal of a document, but the application has to include all of the details about what the city would look like and how it essentially would function. So what is the population you're serving? What population would you intend to be serving in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? What services are going to be provided? How are they going to be provided? How is that different from the way services are provided today? How are you going to collect the funds to cover those services? How is collecting those funds going to impact the neighbors, the county, the other service providers that are providing those services today? What are the potential land uses? What are the potential land uses in 5 years, in 10 years, in 15 years? What are the parcel numbers we're talking about? So it's an extremely detailed analysis that's required to explain, what the city would look like. and what the plan is to fund it. The funding plan has to be at least revenue neutral for the city that would be incorporating, and for the county, and for those other agencies. So if there isn't a sufficient tax base to cover it, there needs to be some sort of tax sharing agreement or some sort of explanation of how exactly these services are going to be covered. So significant legwork would need to be done on the front end to do that analysis, which is one reason some jurisdictions refer to this as an overall formal feasibility study. After the application all of that information is gathered and submitted to LAFCO. LAFCO will review it, and a formal hearing would be held at some point. And if the actual commission determines that they'd like to move forward with this, they would submit that to the voters for approval. An actual majority of voters in the area would have to approve it. Other information or other specifics could be included in that election as well, including election of city council members, recommendations on the name of the city, but a simple majority is what would be required to pass that. After that election, assuming it were successful, the LAFCO would issue a certificate of completion and incorporation, or if it were not successful, a certificate of termination. So that's, LAFCO incorporation in a nutshell. There's far more specifics than I can get into today, but anyone who's interested can find all these details in the government code for further information. So moving from the option to incorporate to a further discussion of where we are today in terms of local review of various applications and land use issues. Currently in place is a Board of Zoning Adjustments. We've got a Board of Zoning Adjustments for the West County and also one for the East County. The West County Board of Zoning Adjustments has 5 members, the East County has 3. And this is a transition that occurred pursuant to state law some decades ago. We used to simply have a single zoning administrator who was one person making these decisions. The state planning and zoning law allows for the Board of Supervisors to elect a formal body that is, essentially multiple people making those decisions by majority vote. The specific powers that a Board of Zoning Adjustments has pursuant to the actual state law that establishes the ability to create BZAs is to decide variances and conditional use permits. But that state statute also says that the board can determine what other powers they would like that BZA to have. So in our zoning ordinance, or in our county ordinance, I should say, our BZAs are also given the authority to hear code enforcement matters, as Albert Lopez talked about earlier. They have the authority to hear nuisance hearings for alcoholic beverage sales regulations violations, for example, and these are their formal decision-making powers. These hearings, the decisions made at the hearings are appealable to the Board of Supervisors, but they are, unless appealed, final decisions. They're not advisory like the Municipal Advisory Commission. They can, however, have advisory powers. They don't have them today under our ordinance, but if the board wanted to give the BZAs some role in giving advisory decisions on various topics, they could do that. We just simply don't have an ordinance at this point that establishes that role for them. Next up is the Planning Commission. We also have an active Planning Commission in the county. Unlike the BZAs, the Planning Commission doesn't have a specific jurisdiction that they cover. They simply cover the entire unincorporated area. The powers of the Planning Commission, similar to the BZAs, are established by both state law and county ordinance. The difference in what the Planning Commission covers is that they make recommendations on the actual general plans that we adopt and the specific plans. Also, zoning ordinance amendments have to go through the Planning Commission before they go to the Board of Supervisors. They make decisions on subdivisions, Interestingly, for certain conditional use permit applications, those are directed directly to the Planning Commission as opposed to the Board of Zoning Adjustments. And the zoning ordinance is very specific as to which applications go to the Planning Commission and which go to the BZA. But when they hear conditional use permits, that's essentially the same hearing as you would have at a BZA. Similar to the Board of Zoning Adjustments, the Planning Commission could be given advisory powers by the Board of Supervisors. Typically, that's not their function at this stage, but they do hear some referrals from the Planning Director for concurrence on Planning Director determinations and definitions and that sort of thing. But they generally are not an advisory body other than making recommendations pursuant to the ordinance for things like the general plan. However, there is another option in terms of utilizing the Planning Commission function, and that is to have more than one Planning Commission in the county. Right now, we just have one with the jurisdiction of the entire incorporated area, but the planning and zoning law, the state law, does allow for a jurisdiction to have more than one Planning Commission. You could have multiple that are responsible for handling different kinds of issues, different kinds of hearings. You could have different levels of responsibility or different types of responsibilities, or you could have planning commissions based on a geographic area. So you could have an East Planning Commission and a West Planning Commission, that sort of thing. Again, we don't have that at this point, but that is something that the state law does permit. The state law that governs boards of zoning adjustments also says that you can use a planning commission to serve a zoning adjustment function. So those hearing CUPs, variances, and anything else, as described by the ordinance, you could have that done by a board of zoning adjustments like we have. You could have a single person, a zoning administrator, do that. You could assign all of those duties to the planning commission and not have a BZA at all. Or you could have an area planning commission that handles just a prescribed portion of the county. And you could have that area planning commission serve the functions as a board of zoning adjustments. Moving on to MACs. MACs are similar to boards of zoning adjustment and planning commissions in that the regulations demonstrating or requiring how exactly a MAC is to be formed and what a MAC can do is also established by state law. And what the state law on Municipal Advisory Council says is that the Board of Supervisors can, by resolution, create a body called a Municipal Advisory Council to provide advice to the Board of Supervisors. So a MAC is by nature advisory because that's what they're established to do. Decision-making power is vested in other bodies through state law, but MACs are inherently advisory in nature. So unlike planning commissions, MACs can't be given Board of Zoning Adjustments type responsibility and actual decision-making. The actual role of the MACs that we have in the county are established by the documents from the Board of Supervisors that created them. And they have a broad range of advisory responsibilities. So as Albert mentioned, they have land use advisory roles, but they also have a role in providing advice on almost any other topic that's going to cover that area. So general health, safety, and welfare issues that could touch that jurisdiction would be an appropriate role for the MAC to provide advice on. Of course, even though the MAC's role is only advisory, the MAC's advice is often given significant weight. As currently formed, our municipal advisory councils are formed by the Board of Supervisors and all the members are appointed. This isn't necessarily required. The state law on MACs establishes that MACs will be created by the board. It says by resolution, but ordinance would be okay too. But however they're created, that method of creation needs to establish whether it's going to be simply by board action or whether the board decides, well, we'll consider doing this, but let's put it to the voters for them to decide whether or not to actually establish a MAC. So that's one method for the voters to be involved in establishing a MAC. And the second is that whether the MAC should have elected members or appointed members is also something that could be referred to the voters for decision. And then, of course, the actual vote, if they are to be elected, would go to the voters. The statute does not explicitly provide for an initiative or anything like that for establishing a MAC. It's not necessarily precluded, but it's not addressed directly in the statute, which says that MACs are to be created by the Board of Supervisors. So there's a little bit of an open question about whether the initiative process would be an appropriate or effective way to create a MAC, but we certainly don't want to indicate that that's not permitted. It's not directly addressed in the statute. But California voters have a broad right to the initiative process, so that may be something that comes into play. With MACs created by board action, as I mentioned, that may or may not be submitted to the voters, just depending on the direction they choose to go. An entirely separate way to have sort of local governance is to establish a community service district. Those are really separate entities. They're not sort of a subgroup, a subpart of the county, the way that MACs and BZAs and planning commissions are. It's a separate legal entity, the way that the county or a city is a separate legal entity. Community service districts can cover specific service issues like fire service, police service. Our Alameda County Fire Department is a district. It's a fire district. So if there's a specific service type that the community is interested in having an actual local agency created to provide, then that community service district would be the way to go. Similar to incorporation, this is a LAFCO overseen process that requires a formal application, thorough documents submitted to establish how the taxation, funding, and expenditures would work. Similar to incorporation or any of our other services that we've talked about, there would need to be some sort of determination about who the governing body would be. They could either be elected or the Board of Supervisors could sit as the directors. But either way, there needs to be some sort of decision-making around that. And of course, their authority would be limited to those issues about the services they provide. It wouldn't be general county land use or advisory functions. My next few slides, I'm not actually going to run through, but they, for your records, you've got them now in your handout. This is just a summary chart that runs through everything I've gone over for the past few minutes, really describing the breakdown and the differences between how these bodies work. And we'll take questions at the end.
Okay, thank you, Heather. Okay, so I'm going to try to get through this so we can get to the comments. I think Priya's going to queue up the next PowerPoint. So in the packet of information, this packet here, you have a page that says information is valuable. So that's not going to appear on the PowerPoint, but this information I might refer you to as I go through the PowerPoint. So it's a sheet that says information is valuable, and on the back of it, it has responding to issues. Okay, so let's kind of go through. So, we've already covered the local governance overview, Board of Supervisors, Municipal Advisory Councils, Planning Commission, Board of Zoning Adjusters, Community Service Districts, and Corporation. So those are basically the array of governance options and overview. And Albert touched upon those as well as Heather. So ELI governance. ELI stands for Eden Area Livability Initiative. It's an initiative that I launched in 2006, and it went for 5 years, and then we did phase 2 and launched it 2013, and we're coming to the end of ELI phase 2. And the ELI is all about trying to look at a vision for livability in the unincorporated communities, particularly the urban unincorporated communities of Fairview, Ashland, Cherryland, San Lorenzo, and Castro Valley. And particularly with Eli Phase 1, we had governance, and with Eli Phase 2, we had governance. And with Eli Phase 1, I think one of the prominent things that came out of the governance aspect of Eli Phase 1 is when you saw the slide up there that talked about the Planning Commission. The Board of Supervisors, we're not restricted in terms of who we appoint to the Planning Commission. And historically, people had been appointed to the Planning Commission to look at land use decisions, and they didn't necessarily reside in the unincorporated area, because every supervisor gets to appoint people to the Planning Commission. So under Eli Phase 1, one of the commitments that I made and Supervisor Alice Bicker at the time made was that our appointees to the Planning Commission would come from the unincorporated area. It's not required, but we made that commitment. And I've actually had recently, as a couple of months ago, one of my good supporters in Oakland who has Planning Commission experience asked me if I would appoint she's an attorney, appoint her husband, who is not doing anything but served on the Planning Commission Oakland, to the Planning Commission for Alameda County. And I told her, well, I made a commitment that my appointees to the Planning Commission need to come from the unincorporated area. And that was something that was, thanks, that was something that was really, really important, because people wanted to make sure that people who were making decisions on land use at least came from the unincorporated area, even though the Planning Commission has 7 members, Albert? 7 members. So even though the Planning Commission has 7 members, at least 3 of them would come from the unincorporated area. And then with Eli Phase 2, we're still in the whole governance process, and Eli Phase 2, that's where we created the Fairview MAC, and we're looking at the Eden area MAC. Another thing with Eli Phase 1, which I just want to point out, which was important under governance that was able to be achieved, was that matters would come to the Board of Supervisors and new information would come up. And like Albert said, we can take up new information. It's a hearing de novo. It's a new hearing, so we can take up new information. So a lot of times we'd get new information, and the MAC's already looked at this project, and let's say the BZA or the Planning Commission's already looked at it, but then now it gets to the Board of Supervisors, we get new information. So with the Eli Phase 1, another thing that we enacted, it allows the Board of Supervisors to remand it back, to send it back to the Planning Commission, to the BZA, or to the MAC for review. So if we get new information, we can handle it ourselves, or we can say, hey, if the MAC had this information, or the Planning Commission, or the BZA had this information, would they have made the same decision? And since we're not obligated to follow the decision and the recommendations of the MAC or the BZA or the Planning Commission, let's send this back to see if that decision would have been different, or that recommendation would have been different had they had this new information. So that whole remand process was enacted, and that's something that I believe it's an ordinance that we passed that allows for that to go back. That came out of Eli Phase 1 too, in terms of a governance matter. And people like that and push for that because they felt if new information comes up, we want to be able to give the Board of Supervisors the option of sending that back, particularly if the community requests that it be sent back. Now with Eli Phase 2, but let's go to the MACs. So here we just put up the government code 31010 that talks about the MACs and how MACs are formed, and Heather spoke to that, and in your packet you've got the actual government code. So we wanted to make sure you had a copy of that, the authority for boards of supervisors to establish MACs as advisory bodies. And also it gives MACs broad latitude, so they can have land use authority, general purpose authority, look at the public safety and welfare and things of that nature. Okay, the next slide. Existing MACs. Now we talked about the fact that there are existing MACs, and so we have a Castro Valley MAC that's been in existence since 1981. So the Castro Valley MAC is the longest serving MAC. It's been around since 1981. We've had a lot of people to serve on the MAC. In fact, if you served on the MAC, could you stand up? If you've served on the MAC, please stand up. I know we've got a couple of MAC members. Linda, Linda, and we have a couple of present MAC members, Ken and Dave. Let's give them a round of applause. And those are kind of present MAC members, but has anyone else in the room ever served on the Castro Valley MAC? Now, you're on the MAC, you're on the Fairview MAC. Stand up, Chris. April, stand up. April, those two are on the Fairview MAC. Any other Fairview MAC members? Okay. And the reason I wanted them to stand up, you folks have elected me the county supervisor. This is my full-time job. I get paid to do this. My staff gets paid to do this. I get paid to take abuse. I get paid to come to a lot of meetings. I get paid to interact with all of you. That's my job as a public servant. These folks volunteer to get abused, to give up their time. And they do. I mean, it takes a lot of time to serve on the MAC, and sometimes they don't get a lot of gratitude for it, but I just really value and appreciate them. And so I just want to make sure they get acknowledged for the service that they provide as volunteers. But keep in mind, they are public officials. They can be sued, and they have been sued, and we've dismissed them from lawsuits in the past, but they can be sued as public officials, and they're under the same kind of guidelines and requirements that I am as an elected official, as county staff or as public officials. But all of us get paid to do that. They volunteer their time. So once again, thank you guys for serving. So the Castro Valley MAC's been around for a while. It's about almost 62,000 people are in Castro Valley. Recently, through Eli Phase 2, we created the Fairview MAC. I used to have a lot of meetings in Fairview. My former chief of staff, Seth Kaplan, and I used to go to a lot of meetings in Fairview, a lot of meetings of a lot of issues, and things are complicated in Fairview. They're very complicated because you've got the interface between rural and suburban in Fairview, and there can be a lot of complications there. And so finally, as a result of Eli Phase 2, we were able to create a MAC because that's something the community had been asking for, and that took a lengthy process to create. And this MAC has only been serving and has only been in place not quite a year. They will have their anniversary in November, their first year. And it took us a while to get them seated. And even though they're seated and they're acting as a MAC, it's still a learning curve. And Chris and April can speak to that. Even though they're serving as MAC, there's still a learning curve. But at least the issues that Fairview have, most of them are being handled through the Fairview MAC. It doesn't mean that my office isn't involved in concerns in Fairview, just like in Castro Valley, we are. But at least there's an organized, appointed official body that can handle things on behalf of Fairview, which is very comforting. Then we have the Snow MAC, was established in 1989, and Tona Hindiger, who's my deputy chief of staff, she used to staff the Snow MAC. And then, as it points out here, MACs can have land use authority and general purpose authority as well. And let's see, the Castro Valley MAC consists of 7 members. The Sonoma and Fairview MACs have 5 members. In the MAC that we are interested in creating through Eli Phase 2, the second MAC would be the Eden Area MAC, which would be composed of Ashland, Cherryland, Hayward Acres, and San Lorenzo. That MAC has not been created yet. It's still going through the process of determining whether or not to create it. Supervisor Wilma Chan and myself are kind of shepherding that process along, and it's been underway now for at least a year to 2 years. And we're hoping that by the start of the new fiscal year, July 1st of 2019, that MAC will be seated and become operational. That is the hope, but there's a lot of details that's taken us to get to this point, and there's still a lot of details that'll be taken into consideration to get that MAC approved and seated. And the Eden Area MAC will represent roughly 69,000 people. The other complication with the Eden MAC, if it's seated, Castro Valley is one community, one large community. Fairview is one large community. with the Eden MAC, we'll be putting together basically 4 communities, or 4 areas: San Lorenzo, Ashland, Cherryland, and Hayward Acres. So there's a little more complication there too. Next slide. Code of conduct. As adopted, the Board of Supervisors has adopted rules and procedures. Each MAC has adopted rules and procedures, and they're required to follow the Robert's Rules of Order, and also they're required to follow the Brown Act. And the Board of Supervisors recently adopted an abusive conduct prevention policy which applies to all county employees, agents, and third parties. The board will consider extending this policy to apply to all boards and commissions. So when we adopted an abusive conduct policy, we didn't include boards and commissions, but I'm going to recommend to the Board of Supervisors that our abusive conduct extend to boards and commissions and not just employees, agents, and third parties. And I think we have a copy of the abusive conduct in your packet. So if you look in your packet, you can actually see the wording of that. And we just adopted the abusive conduct this year. And I know my staff went through a training on abusive conduct just this past summer with County Council and Human Resources. Wait, I'll take questions in a second. Just a second. Now let's see. Similarities between Alameda County MACs. So because we have all these MACs and we're looking at creating another MAC, it's really important, at least that's been my mantra, that all the MACs be consistent. There be continuity in terms of how they operate, how they're appointed, and everything associated with the MACs, so that there's not a different sort of situation for one MAC versus another MAC. So the appointments are made by the Board of Supervisors. The board can remove members at any time. Members generally serve for 4-year terms, but they can serve no more than 12 years. That's a requirement from the board. The chair and the vice chair of the MAC who serve 1 term and are elected by the membership, so that's important. And just recently, the Castro Valley MAC adopted their bylaws, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but we want the chair and the vice chair to rotate. And typically with the MACs, I don't interfere with the MACs. Once they're appointed, they do their job to the best of their ability. I will not tell the MAC, you need to do it this way or that way or else, because my feeling is they've been appointed, they have the responsibility to act on their own intellect to decide what they think would be best. It'll get to my court if it's appealed or it's a matter that needs to get to my court, but if I interfere, I just don't think that's ethical, right, nor fair. So my philosophy has always been, I will not twist the arm of the MAC members. I will not interfere with their deliberations. Occasionally, I'll actually show up at a MAC meeting and make a presentation or remarks, and I always have my staff at a MAC meeting, but I will not interfere with what they're doing. I will not intimidate them. I will not coerce them. I will not do any of that stuff, and I know the MAC members will attest to that, they don't get pressured by me one way or the other in terms of how they are to act on a particular matter. Let's see. Provides recommendations on issues. Okay, so we've covered that. Allows for regular and special meetings. So the Castro Valley MAC meets 3 times a month. The Fairview MAC meets once a month. And we're contemplating that the Eden area MAC, when that's seated, we'll probably want to have them meet twice a month because they have much more population and matters that they'll have to cover. But we can call special meetings for the MACs. The MACs get a stipend. The regular meetings have a certain place where they take place at a certain time and with notification as required by the Brown Act. And then, like I said, special meetings must be properly notified to members and the public. Next slide. So here kind of is a map that shows you the MACs. One of my staff who put this together, Matt Turner's not here this evening. He's actually doing another meeting that he's responsible for, so that's why he's not here. But you can see the territory for the MACs. And actually, let's go back one slide. up there is the unincorporated area up there, and then out here is the unincorporated area in where Sunol is, and extending all the way out to East County. So you kind of get a sense of the entire unincorporated area of Alameda County. Now let's zoom in on the MACs. These are the MACs for the urban area: Castro Valley, Eden MAC, once we create that, and Fairview MAC. And so you can kind of see that. Now, Albert's already pointed out the area that they're responsible for, and it's based on the general plan. Next slide. Public sector districts serving the Eden area. We just wanted to give folks an idea that the number of public sector jurisdictions that serve the Eden area. There's a multiplicity of governmental entities that are involved in the Eden area, so it's just not the county. The county has the overall major responsibility, but there are a number of other jurisdictions that take on responsibility for various matters in the Eden area. Next slide. Issues. So the issues that have come to my attention that have been raised over the course of, most recently, but also over the course of the years, are listed up here, the rotation of the chair. So if you go back to responding to issues, that page, responding to issues, it's in your packet. You can see the response to these issues. So the rotation of the chairs, we just had the Castro Valley MAC adopt their bylaws. I've been consistent with this. I'd like to have the chairs of the MACs rotate. And so the Castro Valley MAC adopted that in their bylaws, and their bylaws will now be sent to Fairview. And unless Fairview makes any modifications to that, we anticipate Fairview will do the same thing. So the chairs rotate, which is really important because I serve on a lot of bodies, even the Board of Supervisors, our chairs rotate. Code of conduct, I already mentioned the code of conduct. The MACs have to follow Robert's Rules of Order. That has a code of conduct, and I think there's a citation in there from Robert's Rules of Order in the packet. No? Okay. But they have to follow Robert's Rules of Order, which has a citation dealing with a code of conduct. And as I said, I want to extend the abusive conduct language and policies that the board has adopted to our boards and commissions. And it's not just the MAC, it's any county board and commission, and we have a lot of boards and commissions that the Board of Supervisors have appointed and approved. Conflict of interest. County Council has opined around conflict of interest. In conflict of interest, usually it's based on both statutory law and common law, right, Heather? Yeah, and County Council can determine, we have orientations around conflict of interest, but MAC members are under the same responsibility that other county officials are under, Albert, myself, et cetera, in terms of conflict of interest. And sometimes with the conflict of interest, there might not be a conflict of interest legally, but there could be an appearance of a conflict of interest. So even if there's just the appearance, it doesn't mean somebody's got to recuse themselves if there's no legal conflict. But typically, even if there's an appearance of a conflict, folks will recuse themselves on the matter just because there's an appearance of a conflict. But legally, they're not required. Transparency and appointment process. The appointment of folks to the MAC and to other boards and commissions is solely within the jurisdiction of each county supervisor, and not just me as a county supervisor, but the other county supervisors and all the county supervisors in the 58 counties throughout the state of California have the responsibility for appointments to boards and commissions and to the MACs. And as Heather pointed out, the appointment process that I follow, and this came out of Eli Phase 1. Folks asked me if a vacancy occurred on the Planning Commission, the BZA, or the MAC, if I would at least post that there was a vacancy for 30 days so folks would be notified that there's a vacancy on any of those bodies and give people an opportunity to apply. That's something that I've adhered to, and that's why this evening, once again, if you live in Castro Valley, own a business in Castro Valley, or property in Castro Valley, there's a vacancy on the Castro Valley MAC. You can pick up this form and apply. and the deadline, the 30-day window, ends on November the 4th. Then after that, after you apply, I will review those applications. I've had different processes in the past where either my staff has helped me with a selection, or I've actually held like a public sort of forum. I've had MAC members help to look at making recommendations on appointments. So I follow different things. But ultimately, the authority for the appointment to a MAC rests with the county supervisor, and then the Board of Supervisors approves that. They confirm that. Then elected versus appointed MAC, the response that I have put in the paper now that I've done a lot of pondering about this over the many, many years is I don't think an elected MAC gets you anything other than the fact you get to vote for an elected MAC. An elected MAC has no decision-making authority. It's advisory. And if folks want to spend, to hold an election for an elected MAC, it's going to cost you anywhere from $4 to $6 per registered voter. So I don't know how many registered voters there are in Castro Valley, but multiply $4 or $6 by the number of registered voters, and that's roughly the cost of putting on an election for a MAC. I'm pretty certain it's at least $100,000 or thereabouts. That's $100,000 that you'll have to spend that could have been used for other services. Plus, the people who run to be on an elected MAC will have to pay a filing fee, just like I have to pay a filing fee when I run. The filing fee is roughly, I think, about $5,000 or thereabouts, something like that. So there's a cost to have an elected MAC, to have an elected MAC that you vote on who has advisory powers, and that's all they have is advisory. I think an appointed MAC and then all these other options that we put up here are much more viable as opposed to an elected MAC. Boards and commissions. When somebody's appointed to a board or commission, it could be a MAC or it could be any board and commission. Folks, when their term ends, they don't automatically come off of that body. They can continue on that body until either they're reappointed or they're not, or they're asked to leave because another appointment's going to be made. So people who are in a position can hold over into that position until it's either filled or until they're reappointed. And that's with not just with the MACs, but with any board or commission that the county has established here. Let me see here if there's anything else that I want to say about any of that stuff. And we've tried to have those responses written out here on the page because that's kind of the basic thing that's come up in results of some of the questions and concerns that people have raised to me. I decided to hold a town hall meeting to respond to all of this as opposed to responding to different inquiries about this from different individuals. I thought it'd be better to hold a town hall meeting and put it all out here in the public so everybody would have the same information as opposed to one person having information, maybe misinterpreting it to somebody else. You've heard the information firsthand from me this evening, and once again, this is being live cast, or live streamed, so folks will hear this and know what I'm saying, what I'm stating. And I think, is there anything else? Any other slides? Okay, so we have finished the presentation. So we can now go to public comment. If you have questions of Albert, Heather, or myself, or you want to just make public comment, you have 2 minutes to do that. And I will have Priya, who has the speaker cards, can call people's names. And maybe just call the first 3 or so.
Mike Doolin, John Sullivan, Nicholas Harvey.
Yeah, just approach the podium and in any order that your name was called and make your comments or ask your question. or questions?
Sorry, the question, without a question that.
And when you speak, I'm sorry, if you could also let us know where you reside.
Mike Doolin, 5794 Highwood Road, Castro Valley. Question about the process before I ask my question. Do we eat up our 2 minutes with questions about what we learned tonight, or are they two separate blocks of time?
There's one block of time, but
Okay.
I've got the discretion to give you more time, or depending when we go through the entire number of folks who want to speak, you could come back again.
Okay. I'll start because I think there's probably a few questions that other people have that are similar to mine. First for Albert, really quick, what data do the MAC bring today in their advisory capacity? So in the MAC meetings that we sit in, we see a lot of opinions. The MAC members are advising, and I think that's their role, that's what they're appointed to do. But when they come back to Nate, to you, to the board, even if their advice is not binding, I would imagine that you and Nate and others have a interest in the data that supports their opinion and advice. We see them, some out in the community, we see some taking comments here, but what's the physical product that they turn over to you as a data set that you then use to conduct your analysis?
Usually that's going to be the action that they take as a full body. It's not individual MAC members, but their real power, I guess you could say, is acting as one unit. And so we will provide them a staff report that has the analysis of a particular project, some of the information that the applicant has provided to us, as well as maybe letters from neighbors or other interested parties. That all gets wrapped up in the staff report. We make a recommendation to them. They take that information in, deliberate it. They'll hear from the applicant and neighbors and the sort of, the way the pros and cons of a project, and then render a decision. That's all in very sort of general, very broad strokes. But the action that they take is essentially the product that they give back to staff or to the planning commission, BZA, or the board. And so we take that decision that they make and move that forward with any other, I guess, pertinent or significant comments that they want to make sure that the higher body is aware of. So that is, they don't do an official, order or anything like that. It's more just of their the action that they take as a body.
Based on their observations? Okay.
Yes.
Thanks. I do have two, that was, I think, a question for just the general comments. I'm just going to go through one more. And to be clear, and for the record, I just want to make sure I am in favor of an elected body. I think, Nate, thank you for this. This is very helpful, I think, for a lot of us to learn the different components that make different elected governments work. Whether it's an elected MAC or another form of elected body, I think it's important that we have elected representation at a more localized level. That a community of this size needs something a little bit more localized. And then I just have another question, Nate. This is for you. I think this is actually something, and also I would imagine other people have. You did mention that the MAC currently, as appointed people, are as appointed in their capacity, they're liable effectively to all the constraints of other public servants, but yet we're waiting to mandate the abusive conduct practice and policy for them. So I want to make sure we're clear. They are liable as other public servants would be, but we have another step or two to go to get them into the abusive conduct clause jurisdiction. So how does that square? I guess they have to ask a different way.
The abusive conduct procedures, standards that the Board of Supervisors adopted, we just adopted it this year. And for some reason, which was an oversight, we didn't extend that to the boards and commissions. So we need to amend our abusive conduct so that it applies to the boards and commissions. That's one thing. Robert's Rules of Order, and like I said, I thought that was going to be provided here. There's a citation in Robert's Rules of Order, of which the MAC adheres to, that also speaks to abusive conduct, that they're already supposed to be adhering to.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, thanks for your time, everyone. And this is very helpful tonight, so appreciate it. Thanks much.
Next speaker, please.
Good evening. My name is John Sullivan. I've been a Castro Valley resident for over 30 years. I live at 17760 Sweetbriar Place in Castro Valley. I was very happy when the Board of Supervisors opted to form this MAC form of local government. This way I felt we got home rule like a city, but without this another big bureaucracy. Over the years, the MAC board has been effective. I feel very effective, very efficient, and its members certainly close to what's going on, and that's important. Would I favor an elected board? Not really. I feel we elect the Board of Supervisors, and they should be free to do their appointing. Castro Valley as a city, no. Our local cities, Hayward and San Leandro, are struggling big time in debt, to CalPERS, for instance, and so forth. So who wants to be part of that? I'd say keep our present form of MAC as it is. It works well. Keep it simple. Our MAC board is not broken, so just please don't try to fix it. Thank you.
Next speaker.
I'm here to talk about sidewalks and roadways. First, my name is Nicholas Harvey. Live at 2308 Hanson Road in Fairview, though on my address it's Hayward. So I'm here to talk about roadways and sidewalks. The San Francisco Chronicle recently reported that San Francisco Bay Area has the worst roadways in the entire U.S., costing drivers about $1,400 per year because all the potholes and things like that wasn't just confined to San Francisco, but the entire Bay Area. As I'm sure you're well aware, unincorporated communities often get left out. I'd have to commend y'all for the recent road improvements on Fairview Avenue and also in Castro Valley, like on 4th Street in the area just south of Grove Way. But I still think we have some issues. So say for, sidewalks, even when I came from Castro Valley here on Norbridge on the south side, we have an ADA compliant ramp that essentially leads to nowhere on the south side of Norbridge. The sidewalk just abruptly ends, and here I find myself in the bike lane and essentially jaywalking across the median. And so, I think we have to be smarter about some of our programs. So, for example, we have the East Avenue sidewalk construction program coming along, or so we hear. And, we have problems, for example, with, some adjacent roads to it not having sidewalks that are going to be constructed. And, we recently had a cyclist that was hit on Fairview. I talked to an officer from Alameda County Sheriff's that was out today writing tickets, and I think that'd be a good revenue generation opportunity, because at East Avenue and Hanson, we just see people speeding through those lights. I have pictures of people walking in the middle of the road, and it's really dangerous for pedestrians, dangerous for cyclists, dangerous for the children that live there or that go to the elementary school there on the corner. And so my question really is what can we do so that we can, spend money smarter and make sure that we can get sidewalks, not just on, fully, basically, not go halfway, go all the way. So anyways.
Thank you. So a couple of responses. First of all, let me just say, our law enforcement agencies don't write tickets for revenue purposes. We want to make that clear.
I know that.
Okay, but you said that, so I want to make sure everyone
know.
Is clear on that. Then secondly, the MACs can take up that issue, as well as we are putting together a Eden area bike ped commission. Once we put that in place, that body could take up that issue as well. It can come directly to the Board of Supervisors through any of the supervisors that represent the unincorporated area. Can communicate that to public works staff. And then the other thing is, Heather mentioned community service districts. If folks really wanted to take on the decision-making authority around streets and roads and things like that, you could create a community service district just for streets and roads, which would include sidewalks. Elect your officials who would oversee that and make decisions around that on your behalf. So those are all of the kind of the range of possibilities.
So can I ask you a follow-up question with regards to grants? So for example, with the East Avenue sidewalk construction program that's coming through, it's about 8,000 feet when you map it out on Google Maps from where East Avenue starts at East Street going up to Camino Vista. And if you were to include 200 feet of sidewalk, which is currently missing on Hanson, and something like 100 feet of sidewalk, which is currently missing on Winfelt, we have a lot of kids and we have bus stops on these corners as well for the 94. And so, it would be a rounding error to construct another essentially 300 feet of sidewalk when you're constructing over 8,000 feet of sidewalk. And so I've asked several people I understand how grants work, if it's not in the purview of this grant for these two adjacent roads, but when you have the people and the equipment there, it makes a lot of sense to do it. And so my question to you is, would it be possible to get that question answered? Because before the project starts, it really makes a lot of sense rather than trying to do it after the fact.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Okay.
Hopefully, my staff are taking down that, and we'll get an answer to that question. And I know Chris is here and April's here from the Fairview MAC, and so between our collective energies, we'll get that answer.
Thanks.
Can you call the next three speakers?
Ellen Griffith, Michael Kuziak, Carrie Sanchez-Para.
Hi, thank you for hosting the meeting. I would just like to put in a plug for a strong code of ethics for the MAC, and I would like to see regular disclosure. I don't know that you could actually outright prohibit them from donating or contributing to supervisors' campaigns, but I'd like to see regular disclosures about maybe quarterly, about MAC members and how much they've contributed to any elected official in Alameda County, because I do see a potential conflict of interest there. I too support an elected MAC. I don't feel that the MAC often reflects my views as a resident of Castro Valley. I think it's a bit antiquated that we still allow people who don't live here to serve on the MAC. I think it should be residents only. Businesses is one thing, but just because you own property, I don't think that historically you should reside in the community that you're supposedly representing. So that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And let me just respond to a couple of your things, and maybe Heather will weigh in too. So there's no prohibition presently that prevents any member of the public or any company from making a contribution to a county supervisor.
Yeah, I figured that's their right.
Right.
But I also
I'm just pointing it out. It's not to say we can't create some type of law.
I've noticed a pattern with all the
I know.
MAC members
Okay,
contributing.
But I'm just giving you the facts. And anybody who makes a contribution to an elected official is required that needs to be disclosed to the Fair Political Practices Commission, of which all elected officials have to file every 6 months. And that's a public document that you can go online and research and see. So the county presently follows what the state law requires. There's some jurisdictions, like the city of Oakland, that has many, many more requirements and restrictions. So a county or city could establish additional regulations and restrictions if they so
I think
choose.
I would support that.
Yeah, okay, so that's one thing, and you might support it, but I'm not sure if every elected, all the electorate in Alameda County would support it. Then the second thing is, people who own property, sometimes we hold elections, and it's not the voters who vote on it, but it's the property owners. Is that accurate? Heather, there's sometimes when just the property owners get a chance to vote on things as opposed to the electorate?
Right, that's true.
Can you speak into the mic?
Sure. That's true. It depends on what kind of election we're talking about. But for example, like I mentioned with the LAFCO petition, it's requires 25% of either the voters in the area or the landowners, so that you wouldn't necessarily have to be a resident to have your voice heard in that type of election.
Yeah. So we respect your opinion, but I'm just letting you know, legally, property owners have the ability to have their voice heard. We can restrict that and not have that be the case with a MAC, but presently we don't do that. Okay. All right.
Hi, I have a few comments and some questions, so I'm hoping questions don't get taken away from my time. I just want to say I really appreciate, my name is Michael Kuziak, I live here in Castro Valley. I really appreciate your opening comments about using facts to base our opinions on those facts. This is a small town. A lot of misinformation can be spread in this small town, a lot of untruths, and it's important that we use facts to argue our opinions. I absolutely think it's critical to implement anti-bullying policies throughout the county. My question would be, what are the consequences and how is it enforced? With regards to transparency to the appointment process, I hope that never again will we allow MAC members be on your selection committee. It should be something that is not driven by the will of MAC members. With regards to representation, the MAC doesn't sound like or look like or ideologically reflect the Castro Valley I see, the Castro Valley that's changed significantly in the 10 years that I've lived here. There's something wrong with the process. We need to figure out a way, if it's not going to be elected, to develop future leaders in our community. With regards to elected versus appointed, I really think this number 139,616 is incorrect. I believe that's the number for a standalone election for a MAC. My question to you would be, what's the cost for a supervisor's election? And I want us to keep in mind the context that we have a $3.1 billion county budget. There is a cost to conducting democracy, and I don't see a problem with having an elected MAC to support that. With regards to the elected MAC, I just want to point out that your position has somewhat shifted, and I'd like you to maybe talk about that and see how this can maybe play out in the Eli process and how we might further sort of wrap things up there and have a further vetting of this in a public way. And then lastly, with regards to member holdover after an expired term, I would just say that's a really odd loophole. It's very, I think, problematic. We are not a historical preservation commission here. We are a municipal advisory council. Our concerns touch every aspect of our lives here in Castro Valley. So I think it's important that we show a fidelity in how we staff that MAC, how we think about it, how we get people on there. And my one last point to county council, one question and one point. Since 2011, there's a state law that's prevented us from seeking incorporation. That's the vehicle license fee change. If any community in California tried to seek incorporation, we would be laughed out of LAFCO. It doesn't make any sense to even try that process. So there's other actions we'd have to take to do that. So I think it's important when we talk about governance solutions, we remind ourselves what really is possible in light of California law. Something that shifted at Eli in some of the comments that I think I heard from you, Heather, previously was the previous county council said that he did not see a legal issue with a MAC being elected and then being appointed to have some type of decision-making powers through a BZA. I feel like at previous MAC meetings, at Eli meetings, maybe that analysis has shifted. And if it has shifted, I would love to maybe have that briefed or something like that so we can see the analysis in the community.
Okay, thank you, Mike.
I appreciate it.
Let me have Heather respond to a couple of questions that you raised, and then I'll respond to the others. So I don't know if Heather knows what the consequences are for a violation of the abusive conduct rules, and then the whole analysis around an elected MAC being appointed as the BZA. And I think the other thing was the fact that it's challenging to become incorporated under state law these days because of the revenue piece.
Sure. So first, on the abusive conduct policy, because the current policy is for county employees, the ramifications of violating county policy, including the very many policies that county employees are subject to, is probably going to be different than what the ramifications would be for the essentially volunteer bodies of something like a MAC or a BZA. So my point is to emphasize that because that policy hasn't been adopted for the boards and commissions yet, there is also not a policy for what happens if you violate it yet. So I think that's still very much in the formation stages, and so it's probably a worthwhile decision point for folks to consider is, what exactly does it mean? Is it a first, second violation kind of issue? Is it, immediate suspension? Is it termination? What exactly are the consequences? For this and any other policy that, is applied to those bodies. So I think that's still an open question. On incorporation, I certainly am not here to, propose it or recommend it or tell you how difficult or easy it would be. Sure. I think one of the most important points in the incorporation discussion is, if that is something that's going to be pursued, it will be complicated and there will be hurdles. I certainly cannot cover all of those hurdles in a meeting like this, and it's not my role to do so either. What was the legality of something being elected and then being appointed to be a decision? Okay, so I think, I don't think there's been a shift in our analysis, so I think maybe it may be a matter of clearing up the nuances here. So a MAC is advisory by definition. It has to be advisory only, so it is advisory. A Board of Zoning Adjustments does make decisions. I think there has been some discussion about whether those two bodies could be combined. So for example, the Board of Supervisors also sits as the Board of Directors of the Fire District. Okay, those are two different entities, same people performing the same different function, similar function for different entities. So I think that may have been the discussion about if the MAC could have BZA responsibilities. That may look something like, they start the meeting at 6 as the MAC, take a 5-minute break, come back as the BZA at 7. So I'm not sure how exactly that would work. But that may be the distinction. And unfortunately, I wasn't at those prior meetings, so I don't know exactly what was said. I will say in terms of combining functions, similarly, a BZA could be given those advisory functions. It just can't work the other way, and it may be at some point, almost a semantic kind of question, but the simple fact is you can't give an advisory body decision-making power per se.
Yeah.
Right, that's possible. I think if that were to take place, and I think this is consistent with the prior discussion, it may not be quite so simple as that, because you've got, what's supposed to be two different levels of review being conducted by the same people. So there may be some kind of questions as to, whether the decision maker can be neutral if they're also accepting or not accepting the recommendation of the advisory body. So there may be some more complicated issues with that, but I think technically it is possible for the same people to serve those functions.
Yeah. So the thing is, a BZA can have MAC authority. A MAC can't have BZA authority, but the members of a MAC could be appointed to serve in the capacity as a BZA. But they would have to be appointed in that capacity, right?
Correct, and both bodies would have to exist.
And both bodies would have to exist. You'd have to have a MAC that exists, and you'd have to have a BZA that exists. And the Board of Supervisors could appoint the MAC members to be the BZA. And the emphasis on is could or may. It's not shall. Okay. And then Mike's other questions, I definitely appreciate you queuing this up because, yeah, we definitely feel that it's important that leadership be developed and nurtured in the unincorporated area. I know we just had My Eden Voice, and we had about 150 folks at My Eden Voice that are coming together around the Eden area MAC, and it was the committee that worked on the MAC formation for the Eden area. So I know Claudia and the staff there working with the community to nurture and develop leadership, which is really fantastic. So we definitely believe in that. And then the Eli process, what we're looking at doing is, and I will cover this maybe a little bit more thoroughly in the wrap-up in the next steps, is conducting a poll. Once Eli comes to an end, and I think you heard me say this at the last Eli governance meeting, I want to conduct a poll and commission a pollster to do the poll, like EMC Research or something, and do a poll of the entire unincorporated area that would ascertain people's opinions about an elected MAC versus appointed MAC, people's opinions about incorporation, people's opinions about other forms of governance, et cetera. And I'm comfortable enough with having folks weigh in and give me their input on that poll, but it would be a professional pollster that would undertake that, and it would do that sampling professionally throughout the entire unincorporated area. And I want to do a poll so we get data. We would get data that would help to ascertain the opinions of people in Castro Valley, Ashland, Cherryland, Fairview, San Lorenzo, et cetera, about how they feel about all this stuff. And then that's the best way I see going forward with that. So that's part of the Eli process. It might take place through Eli because we'll wrap up Eli and we'll probably do the poll after the end of this fiscal year because I need to have the resources to pay for a poll. Then the other piece is, and I've mentioned this to Mike and the others at the Eli governance meeting just a few weeks ago, is once we have the data from a poll, we'd probably take that data to help us inform a charrette that Mike has suggested we hold. You know, we've held charrettes in the past to launch Eli Phase 1 and Eli Phase 2. We do this poll, we'd probably use that information to help us put together a charrette with the input of the community. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about presently, and that would help to better inform us going forward. What a charrette is? Well, it's a French term, and really it's just an opportunity for a lot of people to get together to look at various options and to weigh in their opinions. So it's another form of a public meeting, but we call it a charrette to give it a fancy term. And if you Google it, you can see the official definition of a charrette. So out here we've had 2 charrettes, and at each charrette we've had about 300 to 400 people at each charrette. We had one in 2006 or 2005, and we had another one in 2012, and they were very well attended. So we might, like I said, do this poll and then hold a charrette like in the fall or thereabouts of 2019. Charrette, C-H-A-R-E-T-T-E. Yeah. Thank you. All right. So let's not have a bunch of comments from the audience. If you want to ask a question, just sign up. All right. So I think I've responded to Mike's questions.
I want to thank you, Nate. And I just want to say the culture of bullying that we've experienced in this town is real. It's palpable. It's impacted people I know very directly. And I please do something about it as you go forward and use this as a template, the anti-abuse policy. We need it to reset the conversation and the culture of this community. We need it.
Yeah, well, bullying, we don't want to have youngsters bullied. We don't have the public bullied. We don't want to have adults bullied. Bullying is a form of violence, and I'm the one who pushed the Board of Supervisors to adopt a violence prevention initiative in 2005 that looks at all forms of violence and basically says that any form of violence is repugnant. And bullying is just an aspect of that. So the fact that the board passed an an abusive conduct policy that looks at bullying, we want to get that extended to our boards and commissions. So I need to take that to the board. Okay. Can you call? Okay, yeah, one more speaker, then Priya will call the next 3 speakers.
Okay, good evening. I'm Carrie Sanchez-Pera. I've lived here for decades in Castro Valley. And I'm glad we're talking about policies and procedures. Recently, Sonoma County went through this very similar analysis in July of 2017. They developed some best practices looking at both Mendocino County and Contra Costa County with regard to the MACs and formation of MACs and what that looks like. One of the things that came out of their recommendations at that time, and since they've adopted it, is what not only is the statutory authority, but what are the primary functions of MAC? And what they came up with were 2 primary functions. One is an advisory function, which we've talked about significantly tonight, but one's also an advocacy function. Sonoma County believes that the MACs should play an advocacy role, and I think that that is important here in Castro Valley. I would like our County Board of Supervisors to look at that. They also have that MACs don't have the power to interpret, make, or set policies, ordinances, or laws, and they lack fiscal authority. So they're very prescribed as far as what they're looking at with regard to MACs. They have looked at best practices with regard to the number of members on a MAC, the member restrictions. Their best practice and their template is that members must actually reside within the boundaries of the MAC. They have term limits, they have terms, they have removal processes and procedures for members of the MAC that do not adhere to the policies and procedures. They have training requirements. We've talked about the Brown Act, we've heard about that, but what's the training on that? What's the training that MAC members are provided with Robert's Rules of Orders or anything else? I think that's very important. Just a couple of other things. Conflicts of interest. Nate, I think you had mentioned that the semi-annual Form 700s have to be reported, a biennial report. They talk about advisory topics and other things that I think are very important. So this is a really good template that I think that we can learn from, because not only does it reflect Sonoma County, but it reflects Mendocino and Contra Costa County. And I think Alameda County could look to them and see how we can improve, whether it's existing MACs and existing MAC members, or if it's new MACs like the Eden MAC, having a good template going forward. Thank you.
And this is Sonoma, which counties again?
So now, Sonoma County, they did, and they looked at Mendocino and Contra
Okay,
Costa.
all right. Okay, so I want to make sure Heather gets that. And Heather, did you have a response to anything that was brought up?
No, I don't know if there's a specific question, but that sounds like good feedback, and it's always good to see what other jurisdictions are doing.
Yeah, again, I'm just encouraging and advocating best practices, and since some of our neighboring counties have looked at this, why don't we take a look and see what they've done and glean the best possibility from all of those.
Thank you.
Okay, so, yeah, so we'll do that. And also, I just want to say that in terms of the development of leadership, in terms of the MAC, folks who are appointed to the MAC, one thing I look for is diversity, both ethnic diversity, gender diversity, range of experience. I don't want to put everybody on the MAC who has the same skill set, so a range of experience and understanding and knowledge. We're not always successful in achieving all of those, because sometimes the applicant pool, and also the time and the ability to serve, because it does take time. So sometimes the applicant pool isn't conducive enough to provide someone to be appointed to the MAC who can answer all of those questions appropriately, in my mind. But that's what we're looking for ideally. We want to have people that have an array of experience, so everybody's not from the same level of experience and skill set. We want to have a diversity of gender and ethnicity. We want to have the time and the ability to serve. So that's what we're looking for. And then in terms of conflict of interest, the FPPC deals with both campaign contributions, but also they deal with the conflict of interest, Heather?
Certain conflict of interest rules is governed by the FPPC, yes.
Yes, so we have to file a conflict of interest statement with the FPPC, an economic a statement of interest as well. That's annually, that needs to be done. And then there's sexual harassment training, and what else do we have to get trained on? Is that it?
Definitely those are mandatory. We do trainings for all of our advisory and decision-making bodies. There's the AB 1234 training that we're all required to do, and we also do a separate kind of in-service for conflict of interest and general roles and responsibilities and those kinds of things for our bodies periodically as well.
So I know as elected officials, we go through that, if not annually, every 2 years, and then we have to file statements every 6 months, and then some statements we have to file annually. So the thing is, those rules, not all of them are applicable to appointed officials, but many of them are. And I think it's up to county council to try to see how we can ensure that there's appropriate training and orientation for people who are serving on volunteer bodies. Is that a fair statement?
Sounds right to me.
Okay. The MAC should fill out a Form 700. Do they fill out a Form 700?
I'm not aware of what the practice is for MACs, but every county official is under a conflict of interest policy either required to file a Form 700 or not. So there's certain categories of both employees, officials, and also consultants that may be required to file. So not every single person who works for government despite the fact that we all have a role in government, doesn't necessarily file a Form 700. So it depends on where they sit on those conflict of interest codes.
In a Form 700, that's the conflict of interest form that we have to file annually. And if you don't file it, you can be subject to, penalty and sanction. It's the same thing if you don't file a Form 460, which is a campaign contribution form to show your contributions. And all of this is public. Anybody can get that information from the Registrar of Voters or the FPPC. Okay. So let's call the next three speakers.
And Joanne Lauer, Peter Rosen, Joe Lamberti.
And the FPP stands for the Fair Political Practices Commission. Yeah. So the FPPC, if there's a violation, they have the determination of whether or not to enforce, and then people have due process. They can handle, hire attorneys. There can be negotiated settlements and things of that nature. Yes. Okay.
Hi, Joanne Lauer. I've lived in Castro Valley for 20 years. I'm reading this definition that was in your presentation. It says the MACs allow a formal structure of public representation that enables the board to consider community views. And somehow this doesn't seem to be working. And my example is after Public Works went through a massive public process to propose the update to the bike and pedestrian master plan for unincorporated Alameda County, which included 50 public meetings and over 2,000 comments. And when they brought it to the MAC, and we had several people here in this room, and about 27 people spoke in favor of the plan, and 3 people wanted dirt roads still. And the MAC decided, it seemed to be mostly Mark's opinion, but they all kind of agreed that nope, they represent the community and this is not what they want. I don't know how do you get to that? How does that represent the community when the community went through the whole process to create something like that and everyone came here to support it and the MAC just decides that's not what they want? That doesn't represent the community. And not to beat a dead horse, but I think if the MAC members were actually elected by the community and felt a responsibility to the people who put them there, they might feel more representative of the community.
Are you finished?
I am.
Joy? Okay. Yeah. So once again, the MAC, they can make a recommendation based on their own opinions, their own intellect, and they could differ from what they're hearing from the public that's making a presentation to them and speaking to them and providing testimony to them on a particular matter on a particular evening. They're not obligated in that sense. But the fortunate thing about the MAC is it's advisory, it's a recommendation. So there's going to be another body that has the decision-making authority over that matter. And typically, as Albert pointed out, most of the times what comes from the MAC, we generally follow, but it's not 100%. It's not ironclad. So the MAC could make a recommendation that this is what they think, but the community or the public could show up at another decision-making body and influence that body to make yet a different decision. That's the first thing. Then the second thing is, just because you elect somebody doesn't necessarily mean that those folks are still going to be responsive. So, we're all human beings. People are going to do what they're going to do. So I'm just saying that. An election doesn't guarantee the response that you would hope. It could, but it might not, because there are many elected bodies that, people decide they don't want to support this person for re-election, or they don't support this judge and that opinion that he made. I'm just pointing out examples. An election gives us a president that some of us don't really feel comfortable with. So an election doesn't assure you the type of representation that you might want.
You're a good example Nate. We appreciate your representation, and I wish they were more like you.
Hi, I'm Peter Rosen. I've lived in town a few decades. So I want to, before I launch into this, I want to actually follow that up. I have a question. So while I totally agree with you that I think that elections don't necessarily yield elected officials don't necessarily mean that they're going to respond and give you the responses you want. I do think that elections actually offer a measure of accountability, and right now the MAC doesn't have accountability to the local populace, which was, I think that's part of the issue. But I just want to point out a couple things. I think that the MAC is basically supposed to be a distilled voice of the community, and we need to emphasize this commitment to the community. Words like civility, engagement, participation should all be encouraged. We need public participation, and this is a goal that I think that we all should be encouraging. I pointed out when Ted first joined the MAC that he's been really involved and he would get engaged with a lot of people, and I think that that's great. I think we need a lot of people like that. I think that the Fairview MAC, I think you did a stellar job with the new people that are on the Fairview MAC. I think that they are all examples of passionate community members who are involved in their communities, and they offer a variety of expertise. Earlier you said something about facts are not opinions, but then a minute ago you just said the MAC members will make decisions based on their own opinions. And to me, I've seen on a lot of the MAC meetings that I've been to that decisions are made based on opinions, not upon facts. I think that we need to have more civility, but I also think we need to encourage discussions in a way that we're going to lead to an outcome that is community-based, that we're going to have some community involvement on a lot of these things. But that means that you need to respect what the community has to say. And when the community says something, just because it's not your opinion, we've got a lot of expertise in the community that may be helpful, and I think that we need to see more of that. I distributed to your office and to the MAC members a while ago conduct guidelines from Avila Valley that I modified for Castro Valley that basically use words like hospitable, civility, dignity, and it's about how to comport yourself and remind people that we're part of the community. And the MAC members, I think, need to remember that we need to have more. It's a two-way street. If you represent the community, we need to have listen to the community. So thanks.
Thank you. And I think the code of conduct and civility information that you provided to us, I think Tona Henninger, my deputy chief of staff, looked at that and compared that with Robert's Rules of Order, and I was informed that Robert's Rules of Order covers what you submitted. That's one reason why we didn't move ahead with adopting yet something other than Robert's Rules of Order. The other thing is, Peter, I know you brought it to our attention that maybe MAC members, in order to qualify to be on the MAC, they need to gather so many signatures from folks who live in a particular jurisdiction. And I'm looking at making that a recommendation when we take this to the Board of Supervisors, that we change and that MAC members have to collect, if they're going to be appointed to a body, we require them to collect so many signatures from folks who live in that that jurisdiction, so that at least requires them to get out into the community. So it's just a question of how many signatures, because I know like the Eden area MAC, they're recommending 20 signatures. So it could be 20, it could be 50, but we don't want to make it
2%.
We don't want to make it onerous either. So that's something we're considering. And then the final thing is, keep in mind, I've been an elected official. I've been on the Oakland City Council for 10 years. I've been a county supervisor for 18 years. And as much as I'd like to think I've always comported myself in a civil manner, I might not have. We're all human and we make mistakes at times. So I just want to make sure that people recognize that.
One quick thing, that thing I sent you, it would be more of a commitment that you can just sign that, read through it. It's the language is flat, it's not legalese, it's basically, remember where you're from, and it's pretty straightforward. Anybody that reads that shouldn't say that that's a tough thing to do.
So I see what you're saying. So you're saying, in addition to collecting signatures, have them sign something also that they're going to abide by this these type of rules of civility. Got it.
Hello, my name's Joe Lamberti. I've been in Castro Valley for 18 years. I was looking at your slide that said there's $150,000 for the election of a board. That's a lot of money. I wish I had it in my checking account. But I don't know how that compares to our normal election budget. Is that an extra 0.01%, 1%, 10%? I don't know, maybe it's worth it. And is that per member of the board or the whole board? Then my other question is there maybe a more cost-effective means of getting more input on who's on the MAC? If we could pool your constituents and get feedback from everyone here on the people that you are considering. I don't know, maybe it's through a online, or what was the word you used, a charrette? Is that the correct one? I don't know if that's a way to collect information or opinion on the members. But in general, the better that the MAC represents your constituents, I think it will just help you, because you're more likely your constituents are going to vote for you and make your reelection easier. Thank you.
Well, I just want to say that I don't appoint people to the MAC in the hope that it'll make my election easier. I do appoint people to the MAC in the hopes that it's going to make my job a little easier. And trust me, the MACs have done that. I pointed that out with Fairview. I used to go to a lot of meetings in Fairview. My staff, we'd have to deal with a lot of stuff in Fairview. Now that we have a Fairview MAC, we still have to deal with stuff, but it's been condensed because matters are coming through an official body that's now being appointed, so that helps us out. So I just want to point that out. The second thing is the cost of an election. If there's a consolidated election, the Registrar of Voters estimates that the cost is anywhere from $4 to $6 per registered voter to put on that election. So that's where that figure comes from. And it doesn't matter whether it's school board, special district, city council, county supervisor, the $4 to $6 is the same amount. So if it's a school board election or a special district election like East Bay Mud or whatever, those bodies pay for that. So if you hold an election for a MAC, somebody's got to pay for that. And if you aren't paying for it, the citizens of Castro Valley, then the Board of Supervisors has got to pay for it out of the budget, and that's less money, $150,000, that could be used for other things. So that's kind of how that would work. So there's a cost for putting on an election. That's what we're talking about. And that cost is anywhere from $4 to $6 per registered voter per jurisdiction where that election is taking place. And it doesn't matter what the jurisdiction is, city council, school board, special district, et cetera, et cetera. Those bodies have to pay for that election. And if it's not a consolidated election taking place like during a presidential election or gubernatorial election during a normal primary, then the cost even is higher because the registrar can spread that cost over a lot of different things. Like if you set up a polling place for many races, it's going to be cheaper than if you're setting up a polling place just for one race. And so that's what that's based on. And then the people who run, they also have to pay a fee to run because there's paperwork associated, printing the ballot, putting their name in the ballot, if they file a ballot statement, all those types of things, mailing the ballot out, having the ballot. And trust me, the cost has gone up because we have to have ballots in multiple languages. English, Spanish, Cantonese, et cetera, et cetera. So there's multiple language ballots that's got to be in too. And that's, jack the cost up as well. So all those costs need to be covered. And so that's what that's based on. Who's our next speaker? Nicholas, you can come back if we have time. Did you call other speakers? Okay, who's our next speakers?
I'm Keith Barrows from San Lorenzo. I wanted to mention the gentleman was asking about the charrette. Just to make something clear, I was involved in both Eli Phase 1 and Phase 2. The charrette is a place where, you know, you get together, but you also, the people there get to actually vote on what is to be put forward, what is to move forward. And that is how these things that Nate mentioned that came about in the governance issues. Also, the Reach Ashland Youth Center was born out of Eli Phase 1. And in Phase 2, well, 1 and 2, we finally evolved to getting to have municipal advisory councils in Fairview and soon to be in the Eden area. I grew up in Castro Valley. I've lived in San Lorenzo for 42 years. And I just had one question that should be pretty short, is Supervisor Miley, you said that when you were talking about discussions about the Eden MAC, you kind of rolled out really quickly that you and Wilma were going to be are discussing this, and as to, and these were the words that you used, this is why I'm standing up here, to determine whether or not you were going to create an Eden MAC. It was my understanding that through this process that we've been through with the survey and everything else that's going on, that there will be an Eden MAC, not that you were trying to determine whether there was going to be one or not. So could you clarify that?
You know, I said that intentionally so that you could catch me on that. So, as far as I
see
know,
if I'm paying attention.
Yes, you're paying attention. So as far as I know, yes, we're moving forward with creating an Eden area MAC.
Okay,
Yeah,
it's
just a matter of coming together with the details around that, and then getting at least one other supervisor to support that.
I know what has to happen after. All right.
And we'll be bringing that back to the Unincorporated Services Committee so that the public can hear about that at an official Board of Supervisors Committee meeting. So next speakers?
Okay, my name is Deirdre Lasher. I've been a resident of Castro Valley for over 40 years. The application form for the MAC member is lean, to say the least. What other considerations are not that are taken that are not part of this application? Because this certainly, if it were a job application, wouldn't give anybody an idea of who even to interview. So I'm wondering if there should be an application that included the other considerations too.
Well, right now, that application is the same application the county uses for all boards and commissions. So it's a standard application that we just use for every board and commission. And then once somebody fills out that standard application, then other considerations can be taken into, you know, or other factors can be considered.
And maybe something to consider would be, if there are other considerations, maybe they should be put in writing so that the community could see what they are.
Well, as I said, the things, I might consider something different than what other supervisors will consider, but I'm looking for gender diversity, ethnic diversity, if I can find that. I'm looking for a different set of skill sets so that it's an array of skills as opposed to just a uniformity of skills. I'm looking for time and commitment to serve. I mean, I can think of right now of someone who's serving on the BZA who's been there for a long, long time, and the only reason that person is still there is because we haven't been able to find somebody else who could take that place, who has both the skill set, the time to serve, because the BZA meets twice a month. Yeah, so I'm just, so there all those factors are taken to play. So for instance, we had a very good person on the MAC, Castro Valley MAC. Her name was Janet. She was an attorney, litigation attorney, and I was really pleased that I was able to appoint her, but she had to resign from the MAC because of job responsibilities and family responsibilities. When she got on the MAC, her job responsibilities, she's a litigation attorney, weren't as extensive, and she didn't anticipate that they were going to be as extensive as they were, but her employer put new demands on her while she was serving on the MAC, and so it was either could she continue to do a good job on the MAC, fulfill the responsibilities of being a mother and a wife, and then fill the job responsibilities as a litigation attorney. She couldn't do all of it, so the MAC had to go. I'm looking at all of those factors, and sometimes I'm able to get somebody who can do all of it. Sometimes I'm not, based on the applicant pool.
Yeah, what I'm saying is maybe the community would like to see this in writing so that they know what is being considered. And the other, it's a rhetorical question, really. It seems what I'm hearing is that that the county makes recommendations, submits information to the MAC, makes recommendations to the MAC, then the MAC looks at this, supposedly listens to the community, and then sends a recommendation back to the supervisor. So it seems like it's a sort of a circular recommendation kind of a situation. And does anybody keep, there was a project, says here that that it's unusual for a decision of the MAC to be reversed. Does anybody keep records on what kinds of decisions are reversed, what ones are reversed but maybe changed? Is there data on that?
Yeah, I don't have specific data on that. It happens very infrequently. I'd have to go back into the record and look at in terms of
very frequently. What happens?
Infrequently.
Oh, infrequently.
Yes, I could say, I can count on one hand or less how many times that's happened in the last 10 years. It's infrequent, especially when it comes to projects and permits, things that people are going to construct or open a new business. I mean, those tend to be consistent in terms of the recommendation and the final action.
And does the county staff submits a recommendation originally to the MAC?
Yes.
And the records of how many times the MAC just rubber stamps that, and then the county rubber stamps what the MAC does. So essentially, it's kind of a charade.
Well, no, I think that's why you have the process. I mean, staff, we may get something wrong. We may not have some information that the MAC members know about, or it just could be the fact that something that meets the code still isn't necessarily a good idea at that particular location. So staff, we do the analysis and we put the recommendation forward that we think is the appropriate one. But that does, and this happens with everybody. It's not just the MAC. I mean, it could be something that goes to another body that doesn't go to the MAC. And, we don't always get it right, but I think we normally do, however. But there are those cases when, we just aren't seeing eye to eye on a particular issue.
I would also add that the MAC recommendations are, I think we're kind of thinking of them as either, MAC says yes or no, and is that followed or not. But a lot of the work that's done at the MAC level is a little bit more nuanced than that as well. So it might be, approve or deny a project, but maybe the MAC will say approve it with these conditions that we as the community think are important, for Castro Valley or for Fairview. If it's the color of the building or the architectural design of the building, that might not be something that came out of planning as a recommendation, but when it's brought to that community level for input, that might be something that's then, essentially passed along by the planning department to the next level. So I don't know that I see it as circular as much as the planning department really operating to shepherd, things through from one to another and to forward on information and those recommendations.
Okay, thank you.
Right, Bob, Jennifer Drive in Castro Valley. I've lived there most of my life. What's going on with that hard park that they bought from the Water District?
What's the location of that park?
It's Jennifer Drive, Carlton, and I think Sydney.
Yeah, I'll have to, we can trade information. I can get back to you on that. I don't have that at my fingertips.
Oh, yeah, I'll come back next meeting, we'll talk.
Well, no, I mean, you can just give me your information. I can let you know. But I just, there's a lot of projects, and I just don't know that one by heart.
Okay.
And that is a hard project that they're going to build a park there. So
Right.
it's not necessarily in the jurisdiction of the county.
Okay.
It's hard. Okay? But we can find out the information for you.
Thank you.
Okay. Next speaker.
Hi, I'm Ellen O'Donnell, and I live in Castro Valley, 18849 Sandy Road. I just briefly, because it's so late, I just wanted to say I have, from the time of the Canyon Middle School Town Hall till now, have felt very much in support of there being an elected MAC. I see now that there's move in a different direction. I do have I have a couple questions. One, the cost of the survey that would have to happen. I don't know how that compares to the cost of an election. It seems to me that those things can be expensive, and I do believe that with surveys that they don't speak the way a vote speaks. So I would, even though I know that's the direction that you're heading in, I think that that there's always questions that come up with surveys and holes that can be poked in them in a way that an election, that doesn't happen so much with an election. Also, I am curious about how that would be done, because one thing I have seen over time going to the different meetings, governance and Eli and the ones I've been able to attend, there's always competing, even though we are one Eden area, we are different areas within that. And each area has its own concerns and its own agendas, its own passionate needs and problems. So I think it's really important, should that happen, that there's some way to break out the information according to area. I think that's deeply important so that we can see what people are thinking in each area. The other thing I would like to say, I hope I have one more minute, is I think one thing that's really missing, I've seen since I've lived in Castro Valley, which is 10 years now, what I see that there are, people come to the MAC meetings and the MAC board shows up, but what we don't see is the MAC going out into the community. And one thing, like for example, if someone runs for school board, or if they run for one of the boards, they do have to actually appear in public and make their case and to get elected. I do think that it would be good to have some sort of process for MAC members to connect with the community, to get their input. I don't think getting 20 of your friends or your neighbors to sign a paper for you is really it. I think there's something more that's needed. And even if they were to have occasionally sort of a speaker forum where they could talk about themselves and who they are and introduce themselves to the community in a way that's different than in a MAC meeting where they are specifically addressing issues, I think that would be very helpful. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. And we're definitely open to ideas and suggestions on how we can better get the MAC members, both the ones who are interested in getting appointed and those that are already appointed, how we can get them better connected with the community. So if the audience and the people who are watching this, if you have ideas, if you would submit that to my office so we could take a look at that. Like I said, Peter submitted the idea of folks getting signatures. That doesn't have to be the only thing. There could be other things as well. Obviously, we want to be reasonable because these folks are still volunteers. But yeah, so we're open to taking a look at that. And then we're not going to do a survey. A survey and a poll a survey is a survey. A poll is a poll. And the poll will be done by a professional polling organization that does this. That's their, that's what they do professionally. The county has done a number of polls for elections and other things, like when we're going to do the early childhood initiative, when we're going to do the measure of the housing bond, we're going to do the measure for health care. Sometimes candidates do polls. So I'm going to commission a poll, and it's probably going to cost maybe, I'm just guesstimating, $30,000, $40,000 maybe, because the cost is more when you sample more people, and I want to make sure we sample a good sampling of folks, and we want to sample people not just from Castro Valley, but we want to sample people from Fairview, Castro Valley, San Lorenzo, Ashland, Cherryland, and Fairview. So we want to have enough of a sample, so that increases the cost of a poll. Then, like you said, we want to have information from all those different areas about how they think, as well as overall how people think for the entire urban unincorporated area. So that's why I think the poll is going to be expensive, but it's going to provide us with a lot of good data. And as I said before, once I move ahead with the commissioning a poll, because it's going to come out of my budget, I'll be having the folks who are going to do the poll talk to the community about possible polling questions and things like that, because these are folks who do this, professionally for a living. So it'll be fair and it'll be unbiased as well. And then we'll have some real good data and information. And so the cost of a poll, $40,000. The cost of election, $140,000, $150,000. And then a poll's just one time. An election, keep this in mind, is every 2 years. You'd have to put that expenditure out every 2 years in perpetuity unless we stop holding elections for a MAC. So every 2 years, there'd be elections because, MAC members, the first, we would have staggering terms, and then after that, people would be elected. They might serve 4 years, but there's always an election every 2 years. Yeah. So that's an ongoing cost, as opposed to a poll just going to be a one-time cost. Hopefully I answered your questions. Okay. Anybody else have questions?
We have Chris Higgins.
Okay, Chris.
Couple of observations, but the first one is really a question for Heather. As a member of a new MAC, do I need? I heard this liability. Do I need a larger umbrella policy? And I'm serious.
Okay, well, so I can't give that kind of legal advice directly to you, especially not in a public forum. So it's a fair question. I understand that there is some risk in the sense that sometimes individual board members are sued in their individual capacities. So that's something we can talk about offline in terms of what the limits of that risk probably may include in your public capacity. Probably not today.
It's okay. Just want to put it out there. When you're volunteering for something. And just a couple things coming together at talking about what, Albert, you were talking about the interaction with the staff. And what I find that works best, and again, this is just a year in the job here, and Nate knows I'm learning a lot. But, before the meeting, I've got the staff report, or I know it's coming up, and I'll have some correspondence with the staff and, ask questions. The last meeting we had, the item that was on there probably had a half a dozen emails back and forth with Andy on, hey, what does this mean, right? What is this in the ordinance, and can you flesh this out in your report? So it's like, we don't show up there on the day of the meeting and read this thing and go, oh, holy crap, what's going on here? And we're out there with the staff, and of course, over the years we've done that, but I just kind of want to make sure people know that. And just two other quick things. One is, I'd encourage everyone that's interested in this kind of stuff to come out to the Eli meetings and participate. A lot of what was covered today has been there. It's a big deal, and you'll meet some really cool people. The other is, if you're interested in this, I really recommend that you sign up for the annual County Leadership Academy. Is that what they call it? I think I went through that in 2005, 2006, and it was a good use of my time. So let me leave it at that.
Yes, I'm glad Chris mentioned that the county puts on a leadership academy, and it gives you a lot of useful information about the county budget, the county departments and agencies, everything you wanted to know about county government, and it's very useful for citizens. So it's our Leadership Academy, and we also have an academy for youth as well. It's very, very useful, very informative. The one other thing that I just wanted to respond to about MAC members being public officials and being liable. Often, and I'm not, it doesn't happen often, but if you are sued in your capacity, your official capacity, you know, the Board of Supervisors, we can take a look at that and we can decide, you know, the county is going to cover that or not cover that, you know, cover your exposure. It's not guaranteed. And I know, for instance, when we were sued, county was sued, the MAC was sued, Castro Valley MAC was sued on a particular land use decision. It was really dealing with Redwood Christian and the expansion of the school out there. Ultimately, the members of the MAC were dismissed from that lawsuit, but they were sued in their official capacities initially. And we, and the board voted, in, you know, behind closed session that we would cover, you know, their legal defense around that, but they were dismissed. But I'm just saying it's not always guaranteed. Because somebody could go out and do something that's totally egregious, and we would say we're not going to cover, you know, your legal expense for this, because this is just out of the, you know, the ordinary. Okay, so I really appreciate everybody coming. Appreciate that this was live streamed. I hope you found this to be informative, because as I said, we wanted to separate fact from fiction, and as I said, people can have their opinions. Wanted to get some useful information out there. The next step is I do want to conduct a poll so we can get more information that will help us to be more informed about how people feel about governance going forward in the unincorporated area, and then use that information to help us shape a charrette. And all this would take place probably in the next fiscal year, 2019-2020, 2019-2020 fiscal year, mainly because I'm pretty tapped out. I probably overexpended my budget as it is. So, you know, all that stuff over there and all these staff members out here, I'm just kidding. That's not why I'm overextended. I just have a lot of people coming at me for a lot of different things. So I'm probably already overextended in terms of commitments for my resources for this fiscal year. So to do a poll, which is going to cost a healthy chunk of change, and to do it right, I need to make sure I budget for that. And I haven't budgeted for that in this fiscal year, but I will budget for it in fiscal year 1920. So thank you all for coming out, and hope you found this useful.